Next section of chapter number 2. In this section, we are going to cover 3 questions off your guide of reading. I believe they're questions 9, 10, and 11. They are questions like, what were the causes of unrest in the Chesapeake by the late 1600s? We're going to get to that one right away. Compare Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia with the uprising of John Coode in Maryland. Be sure to discuss causes and results. Well, that's going to be next. And last but certainly not least, what were the reasons for a shift from indentured servitude to slavery in the Chesapeake? This is going to be a major theme in American history. So why it's the last question of the day, this is a pretty big one. Definitely one that you want to make special attention to. Okay, let's talk a little bit about where we're at. We're in the late 1600s. We talked about those British navigation that happened in 1660, 1663, 1673, and this causes some unrest, some panic. People do not like losing money, and in essence, remember, this gave the British government license to kind of regulate what businesses did, take money essentially out of business owners' pockets. So that was not well received within the colonies. The other thing is, remember we talked about this idea of government, like self-government among the colonists. This is gigantic in all of the colonies that we're going to talk about coming up, which we're going to talk about a lot of them. Nobody likes to lose their right to their own kind of self-determination, and it doesn't really sit well with colonists. They don't want to be told what to do. So this creates a little bit of unrest. They're used to making their own trade deals. They have some trade opportunities with lots of countries, the Dutch being one of them. This all kind of goes in line with tobacco prices dropping. So it's one thing to all of a sudden have like, oh, they're taking money from me. But another thing is that I'm making less money. So, you're getting it from both ends. So that creates some unrest. The other thing is indentured servants were outliving their servitude. Why this was such a big deal is because they started becoming competition. They garnered land, a land of their own. They produced it, led to more production, more tobacco in the market, which lowers prices, and that creates an air of uneasiness. Those indentured servants also became poor because it makes it a little bit harder to kind of make your mark with so much product on the market. It makes it tougher to pay off debts, for sure. Assemblies increased the term for servitude because during this time period in the late 1600s, there are some indentured servants that once they kind of gain their freedom, they can't make it. They have so much debt that they actually go back and sign another servitude agreement to kind of pay off that debt. That was a problem. So the assembly saw that, and they needed, they wanted, again, that cheap labor. So they increased the term of servitude. They also took away political rights of landless men, like not as much right to vote, that sort of thing. So not as much right to vote, should be no right to vote. I don't know where I got the not as much from. That's okay. The next question we kind of talked about are there's 2 rebellions that kind of, they're a little different, but they both kind of show where a lot of these poor people are coming from. There's Bacon's Rebellion that occurs in Virginia, and the Coode Rebellion that happens in Maryland. And they both have different ways they go about it, but they're really for similar reasons. Bacon's Rebellion occurs in Virginia. There's a guy, Nathaniel Bacon, who's pretty well-to-do. There's a couple other immigrants that are well-to-do, and really they want to come over to make their mark. They want to make money. So they kind of go petition the government. They want to trade with the natives to make money. The governor of the area, the governor of Virginia, basically says like, hey, that's my turf. He had a monopoly on that with the trade with the natives. That he included a couple of other friends, but he wouldn't allow others in. This doesn't sit very well with people. Also on the western part of the state, the further you push inwards, a lot of those indentured servants were forced inwards. The prime real estate happened kind of along the coast. The further in you get, the less desirable at the time it was to be there. So those people had more contact with, those frontier people had more contact with natives. Nathaniel Bacon kind of went out there and sided with those frontier farmers. So basically helped them fight like Indians. And then they came back and they turned on the city. They turned on Jamestown. They turned on William Berkeley, the governor. Eventually, they ended up basically like trashing the city. They called it a rebellion. They called it Bacon's Rebellion. And it has a pretty tragic ending. Like I said, Jamestown ends up in ashes, and the rebellion's only ended when Nathaniel Bacon dies. So it's no good. In Maryland, a little different story. It's called Cood's Rebellion. It wasn't really termed a rebellion necessarily by the government. And again, kind of the same story. Like the Calverts and a lot of their friends had a monopoly on, this time it's political power. The farmers wanted to share in the power. They wanted to be able to make some of these decisions. They weren't given that opportunity. It didn't help that there was some religious differences. In Maryland, remember, the Calverts were strong Catholics, where most of the farmers were Protestants. So what happened is John Coode gathered his army. He captured the governor. And then they went to England, actually, and petitioned kind of the government in England and said, hey, this is what happened. Like, this is what they're doing to us. England was actually somewhat sympathetic. They revoked the charter of the Calverts. And they didn't get it back until 1715. So it was, 30 some odd years. In the meantime, the Calverts become Protestant, kind of easing the transition back. But they do get their power back. So that's kind of what happened. Okay, the last question that you're going to have to kind of talk about is from servitude to slavery. So we have this system in the 1600s. And really kind of the first part is really built, the economy is really based on the work from indentured servants, white indentured servants. Truth be told, early planters preferred using like indentured servants, white indentured servants. And the reason being is they were cheaper. They had a time span, whether that was 4 to 7 years. So they didn't have to pay as much to get those indentured servants. Remember, life expectancy wasn't that high anyway. So the chance of you getting your full 7 years wasn't even fantastic. So a lot of people wanted to go that route. They wanted to go to the indentured servitude route. You were paying for that. If you bought a slave, you were paying for the duration of their service, which was life. So a lot of people preferred the indentured servant. This is going to change. First African slaves were brought by the Dutch in 1619. By 1675, the Chesapeake had less than 5% of their population were blacks. And by the time you hit like 1740, we get up to like 40%. So you're going to see the slave trade greatly elevate those numbers. Now the first ones came when it started picking up steam. Those blacks were coming over. There was a few that were free, not many. If you're looking at the PowerPoint, it almost looks like they're in thirds. I probably should have been a little more specific. Some were free, but not a third by any stretch. Some were indentured servants, so they came over just kind of the same deal. And some were slaves. Now, the first batch, most of them did not come from Africa. A lot of them came from the Carolinas, the Caribbean. A lot of them had picked up the language. A lot of them had converted to Christianity. So they were a little different. That first batch of slaves, this was kind of like the transition between indentured servants and black slaves. So you did have black and white working kind of side by side. They socialized together. They had some relationships, some sexual liaisons. If you want to, let's go there. They had similar punishments. So a lot of times they would plot against their owners, and they would do things, whether it was stealing or whatever, and when they were caught, the punishments were pretty similar. So this is going to drastically deteriorate for the black slaves. As we go further on, treatment is going to get worse and worse and worse. This seems to be a little bit of a trend. It's going to happen the same thing's going to happen after slavery. It's not that they got a great deal by any means. They did not. But the deal they got after slavery was distinctly better than 10, 15 years later. It got worse and worse and worse. Some of the rights they were given whites in the South found ways to prevent them from using those. All right, it's a little sidetrack. We didn't mean to, shouldn't have went there. Okay, after 1680, things definitely change. Again, we see a major transition They were much higher mortality rates. So we saw people living longer. Because of that, slave owners figured African slaves were a better investment at this point, because we can get more than 7 years out of our investment. They also would have title to any children that were had. So again, if you had a slave couple that had 3 kids, then without any additional investment, those plantation owners had 3 extra slaves. So they took that into account as well. This meant the slave trade really swelled, like I mentioned, by 1740. The numbers had just skyrocketed, and I can't spell Caribbean at all, so don't pay attention to that. There were also many companies that competed on the market. It wasn't just one company that competed to sell slaves. There was multiples that were getting involved. They came from the colonies, they came to the Caribbean, they came to South America, Africa, and more. Truth be told, there were more slaves that went to South America and the Caribbean that came to the United States. There was just a tremendous amount. Between 1700 and 1850, it's estimated there was 21 million slaves that came from West Africa. 21 million. That's crazy. Like I said, a lot of them went to South America. There was about 9 million that were deemed set for the Americas. A lot of them never made it because of we're going to talk about this in a minute, because of just the harsh conditions coming over. So they never made it here. It was just so brutal. About 7 million of them stayed in Africa. So they were traded in Africa, and they were slaves in Africa. So there was just a lot of it going around worldwide. This wasn't just a United States problem. I saw actually just recently on the floor of the U.S. Senate, one of the U.S. senators said slavery was created in the United States. That is very, very false. Slavery was a world problem. That being said, this is not something to let the United States off with. We jumped in with both feet, but it happened a lot of different places. Coming over, the Middle Passage is what is kind of commonly referred to as the shipment over. Now, what ended up happening is the first wave of slaves generally were people that were in debt or were kind of prisoners of war or criminals or whatever. After that was not the case. They were people that were minding their own business, that were literally captured and chained and brought over here, like just minding their own business, and all of a sudden 2 minutes later they're in chains and they're kind of bound for a different location as a slave. They were put in holding cells, and then eventually they had to they were just crammed into ships, and they were just jam packed into ships, and just in ungodly ungodly circumstances, like barely sit up or lie down. I mean, the heat was unbearable below the decks of these ships. Just lots and lots of people died. And, I mean, you're sitting next, you're potentially sleeping next to a corpse for the duration of your trip. That didn't smell very well. Disease, obviously, is prime conditions for disease. So that wasn't good. So a lot of people died in the Middle Passage. The first year of your enslavement, a lot of people died too. They were exposed to illnesses they had no resistance for. About a quarter of slaves definitely died during that. Okay, there were more African slaves as we kind of went along, instead of coming from somewhere else. The laws became much more racist during these times as well. Punishments on indentured servants were once kind of one situation, and then all of a sudden they were a different set of circumstances for African slaves. Getting whipped, that sort of thing. So there were many more racist laws that kind of perpetuated the system. Indentured servants were getting other opportunities. Easier for them to own land. They didn't have to pay taxes, or they had to pay taxes, but at lower rates than they did before. They got a right to vote. So this kind of, in their heads, they're thinking they're one step further. There was more land on the frontier because we cleared people out. There was also more women that were over here, closer to 50-50. So more indentured servants had the opportunity to start families. This was kind of a big deal. Most of the people had no slaves. And let me we're going to end this video because I'm reaching a time limit. I'm going to come back with part 2 of this.